Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
I was going to take you live to central London, where the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, is speaking at a manufacturing conference.
My dad was an electrical engineer who worked successfully and successively for Westinghouse, English Electric and later GEC. He was a design engineer. He enjoyed good, satisfying work with reasonable pay. The contributions of manufacturing, of all of you, to our economy cannot be understated. And the case for supporting more manufacturing jobs and industries is absolutely undeniable. Yet for too long, government hasn't done enough to support you. Businesses are crying out for infrastructure investment. We're lagging behind other leading economies in this, but the government simply isn't delivering. That's why we have pledged to create a national transformation fund to upgrade our transport, energy and digital infrastructures so that it's worthy of the 21st century. We must also invest in our people as well as our physical infrastructure. We have, on the one hand, university graduates who can't find a suitable job, while thousands of underemployed workers can't get the skills they need to advance. And on the other hand, businesses struggling to recruit workers with the right skills. Time and again, businesses tell me how difficult it is to hire employees with the skills they need, and that far too often school leavers are unprepared for the workplace. Labour's National Education Service proposal will tackle that problem head-on by providing free, lifelong learning for all, so that anyone can retrain or upskill at any point in their life. We will put vocational education, too often the poor relation of our education service and system, at the heart of our National Education Service, ensuring that science and technical learning starts early in primary schools. Children in primary schools should engage in practical learning from a very, very young age, not just through the classroom, but through play and activities. The importance of construction games, construction toys and science games are so important to very young children to understand how things work, why things work, and that then helps them to develop those very necessary functional skills for the future. And that must also carry on through into secondary school. Practical skills mean that young people are better able to understand the whole concept of engineering and design in the future. And we will build links with industry into the National Education Service to make sure that our education system keeps pace with the changing needs of our economy, expanding the type of training that qualifies under the apprenticeship levy so that businesses can actually use it quickly for the skills that they need. The Tories' approach to Brexit is threatening to turn our skills crisis into a catastrophe, especially for manufacturers who rely on recruiting skilled workers from overseas. We have said from the start we would give an unconditional guarantee to EU citizens of their right to stay in Britain, not just now, but during the transition period as well. This is not just because of the valuable role that European Union citizens play in our economy and many of your businesses, but because they are people who've built a life here. I represent many of them in my own constituency. Unlike the Tories, we will not use people, mothers, fathers, neighbours, friends, as bargaining chips in the negotiations. Brexit is, for many, an emotive subject. But for business, it is first and foremost a practical matter. To make decisions about where and when, perhaps even whether, to invest, you need to know what markets you will have access to, what regulations and product standards you will be expected to be subject to, and who you will be able to recruit to work with you. What will happen to our very important supply chains, which of course extend both sides of the Channel, which we all know are very integrated supply systems at the present time. That's why Labour has, from the start, taken the practical position of accepting the result of the referendum and insisting the economy must come first. We're leaving the European Union, but our businesses must not be forced to withdraw from European markets. Business needs clarity, and with 4 out of 6 of the government's road to Brexit speeches already delivered, it seems to me their approach to Brexit is, if anything, even less clear. It's time for the Cabinet to stop fighting and the government to say where it wants to take the country. It's not just in the approach to Brexit that the government is failing to put the economy first. For too long, manufacturing has been undervalued by this government and indeed by too many commentators in our society. For all their warm words, whether Osborne's March of the Makers or the government's newfound enthusiasm for the words industrial strategy, for decades the Conservatives have created, encouraged and sustained a system that rewards those who lend and speculate over those who make things. The Thatcher government's progressive abolition of restrictions on financial trading, culminating in the Big Bang deregulation of 1986, placed the needs of speculative finance at the helm of British economic life. When that government took office, the ratio of private debt to GDP was 60%. In the 30 years that followed, that has trebled. That increase wasn't due to banks supporting a healthy and productive economy by lending to businesses represented here today. It was because banks started lending to households and inflating house asset prices on a scale never seen before. At the same time, investment banks started creating new kinds of financial products, packaging up debt in increasingly opaque ways and becoming ever more removed from the real economy of where people make things and deliver things. Let me be very clear. Finance has a central and essential role to play in a functioning economy. Without access to finance, how would the entrepreneur or business person just starting out find the means to get their idea off the ground? How would a growing company afford new equipment that will make their businesses more productive and more profitable? Or expand their activities by opening new premises? Finance is the grease that oils the wheels of the economy, and without it, economic activity would seize up. But when private debt is twice the size of the real economy, when traders no longer understand the products they are trading, and banks are funding their own speculation rather than productive investment, something has gone grossly and badly wrong. Banks should be helping the real economy, not suffocating it. Let me remind you of the words of John Maynard Keynes when he said, "There cannot be a real recovery until the ideas of lenders and the ideas of productive borrowers are brought together again." Seldom in modern history has the gap between the two been so wide and so difficult to bridge. Keynes was writing about the Great Depression of the 1930s, but the gulf between finance and the real economy may today be even wider. We know the results. Money flows away from productive activities that you're engaged in that create jobs and export, to instead inflate asset prices, concentrating money in the hands of a few owners, not producers, while households become more reliant on borrowing. And we end up with an economy with more risk, more volatility, and more instability. It was a heads I win, tails you lose gamble for the banks, not my words, those of the Governor of the Bank of England. And we're all still paying for the inevitable crash. When the last Labour government stepped in to shore up our major banks as they stood on the brink of collapse, it prevented a total meltdown. But the public should have been given a say in how the banks propped up by our money were being run. And there should be a much more concerted effort to rein in bank speculation, to refocus on productive lending. We need a fundamental rethink of whom finance should serve and how it should be regulated. There can be no rebalancing of our distorted, sluggish and unequal economy without taking on the unfettered power of finance. For 40 years, deregulated finance has progressively become more powerful, its dominance over industry very obvious and destructive, its control of politics pernicious and undemocratic. The size and power of finance created a generation of politicians who thought the City of London could power the whole economy. Out of control, financial wizardry and gambling were left barely regulated, while real economies in once very strong and proud industrial areas were essentially put into a process of managed decline. The welfare state was left to pick up the slack, with sticking plaster redistribution to the people and places held back by the finance-led boom of predominantly the southeast of England. For a generation, instead of serving industry, finance, politicians have served finance. We've seen where that ends. The productive economy, our public services, people's lives being held hostage by a small number of too big to fail banks and financial institutions. I simply say no more. The next Labour government will be the first in 40 years to stand up for the real economy, the manufacturing economy. We will take decisions and decisive action to make finance the servant of industry, not the masters of all. The reign of finance doesn't stop at the gates of City of London. The extractive logic has spread into all areas of life, with short-term performance and narrow shareholder value prioritised over long-run growth and wider economic benefit. Take GKN, for example, one of the world's oldest and most prestigious engineering firms. It had a big factory in Telford, where I grew up, which employs 6,000 workers across the UK, contributes an estimated 1.3 billion to the economy, pays a healthy 174 million in tax each year, and invested 561 million in research and development in the UK alone. And yet, GKN is currently facing a hostile, allegedly debt-fueled takeover by Melrose, a company with a history of opportunistic asset stripping. It's an all too familiar story, like when Kraft took over Cadbury's, a valuable company could be sacrificed so that a few can make a quick buck. We rightly praise the growth of companies like GKN and their location in the UK. And yet, when we're faced with the possible destruction of that company, the government doesn't act. That's why the next Labour government will broaden the scope of the public interest test to include explicit consideration of the needs of our economy, taking advantage of new freedoms that we may have to allow the government to intervene to protect our industrial base. An important step towards reprogramming the economy so that it works for the many, not just the few. Reprogramming our economy to reward good business practices, reining in speculative finance so that it serves, not distorts, the whole economy, backed up by strong industrial strategy, investing in our physical infrastructure and our people. This approach, I believe, is vital if we're to develop our manufacturing strength. That's why the next government is committed to working with you to achieve this. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. I'm going to open it out to the floor in a second. I just want to start with one of my own questions. You mentioned there at the beginning about me winning Young Engineer for Britain. When I won that, Labour were in power, and the view very much at the time was we need to get more women in engineering. 15 years later, and it's still a big problem. So how do we know? Like, there's been lots in there about all the things you're going to do, but how do we know you are actually going to do this? Because we've heard it before.
Well, it's a very fair question to put to anyone. My view is that if we don't give women a decent chance in life, don't give girls a decent chance in school, then we end up discriminating against them. We end up with a less productive industry because we're not giving young women the chance to go into engineering. And so the point I'm making is that we have to raise the esteem of engineering and manufacturing at a very early age. And that's why the relationship between local companies and schools is important, but it's also about the idea that you can be an engineer whether you're a boy or a girl from the very beginning and not start stereotyping jobs. it's changed a great deal in other professions. I mentioned teaching, I mentioned law, I mentioned medicine, where in some areas there's now a majority of women students in university. In engineering, it's gone the other way, and it's time to turn that around, and I am very determined to do that. Listen, I was lectured by my mum on this all my childhood. She had 4 sons, so what else could you do? Yeah.
Okay, let's open this out to the floor. Yeah, we'll get mics over to you. We'll just get a mic to you now. If you just keep your hands up if you've got a question, and then we'll get keep your hand up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Peter Walker from the Guardian. Mr. Corbyn, you're saying that businesses need certainty over Brexit. But when it comes to single market and customs union, do you think Labour does provide that certainty businesses need? And how does your certainty differ from the government's position on this?
We have to have access to European markets. We have to have a customs union that makes sure we can continue that trade, and particularly between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. That is key to it. Being a member of the single market is automatic if you're in the EU. If we're not in the EU, you're not automatically a member of it. And so what we are determined to achieve is a tariff-free trade relationship with Europe, but also to say that we're not proposing a deregulation of our economy to undercut Europe, and we're not proposing a sweetheart deal with the USA or anyone else, which would result in deregulation in, for example, food or agriculture. We're very determined to achieve that. And since I became the leader of the party, I've travelled a great deal to many parts of Europe in order to build good relations with colleagues in political parties all across Europe, but also of those parliaments. So we're in a position to undertake those negotiations. We've obviously met the European Commission on many occasions. I don't know when any election might take place, but I'm very determined that we will have that effective relationship with Europe. Think about it. I'm sure you all do. If you look at Ford Motor Company and its engines made in Bridgend, those engines cross the Channel several times before they're completed. Most of them end up back in Europe at the end of it. If you have a tariff arrangement between Britain and Europe for that process, the process simply won't happen. Same with Airbus, same with Rolls-Royce, same with BMW, same with all the big manufacturing companies. There has to be a trade relationship with Europe, but you best achieve that by negotiating with respect, not threatening Europe with an undercutting economy on the shores of Europe.
Let's take a question there from the lady in the red jacket. We'll just get a microphone down to you.
Mr. Corbyn, thank you for coming to see us today. I'm Managing Director of a small rotation moulding company in the East Midlands. You've talked about getting and training a skilled workforce, but it's not this part of the workforce where we have a problem. We will train new recruits. In January, we were 25% short of manufacturing machine operators. We recruit locally, but there is full employment in the East Midlands. We rely on immigrants. And with the drop of net immigration, it's hit us hard, and we cannot find the people we need. What will the Labour Party do to help us attract this Labour to the UK?
Thanks. That's a very fair point. And indeed, I've heard similar accounts of things from medical research companies and others that can't recruit, not just in Europe, but outside Europe as well, because sometimes the skills are not necessarily available. What we've said is, first, that we would legislate to guarantee rights of residence to all European Union nationals here, because there's a huge degree of uncertainty. Secondly, that we would recognise that there has to be a movement, particularly of skilled workers, across the continent and across national borders. All companies rely on research from each other. All universities...
Well, Jeremy Corbyn there at the manufacturers' organisation, spelling out some of Labour's thoughts about Brexit, answering questions from journalists and also from some of those involved in manufacturing in the audience.
I've been getting away with it all